All right, guys, we're going to go through removing this 4L80E step by step. Now, the first thing you'll see is on these 4L80Es, whether it's a diesel or a gas engine, is you've got this exhaust crossover pipe is going to be blocking our access to this inspection cover. And we'll have to get this inspection cover off in order to get the bolts that are retaining the flex plate to the torque converter. So one of the first things that we're going to need to do is to remove this exhaust crossover. After we get the exhaust crossover out, we'll be able to remove this inspection cover. Now you'll see we still have, this is a four-wheel drive vehicle, and we can still see one of the shafts from the transfer cases here. What I'm actually going to do, so not every vehicle is going to have this, right? Some are going to be two-wheel drive and not have this. I'm going to put the removal of the transfer case in a separate video because that actually has a different problem, and we got to pull it anyway along with the 4L80. So when you see the rest of this video, you'll see this piece off, and I'll put a link up in the upper right for you to watch the video on removing the transfer case. This one has an auto track, so if you happen to need to remove an auto track type transfer case, we'll cover that separately. But let's go ahead and get into the exhaust. All right, guys, we're on the driver's side front wheel area. We've got the wheel off. We've got this up on a jack stand and jack for backup. We've taken off the dust shield here, right? And that's very easy to remove. Just get yourself a trim tool and you pop these clips out of these holes. Do it carefully. If yours is busted or these are broken up, I'll put in the description the replacement part numbers. These parts do serve a purpose, so you should keep them in good working order. Now we're going to come in from this angle. Hopefully we have enough light. And I'm going to show you, this is the exhaust manifold on this particular engine, and then it's got a flange, and then there's a gap. You can see a little bit of the gasket, and then there's the flange for the crossover pipe. There's 3 bolts on this particular engine. This is the 6.5 liter diesel, I said. 5.7 liter gas. I'll have studs and nuts. A lot easier to deal with than this. With these bolts, it's like trying to take off the studs, but you can see either type depending on the engine. I'm going to give you a closer view of this particular bolt back here. We're going to take a different perspective just so you can see the kind of problem you run into with this kind of setup. All right, guys, so here's a closer view of that bolt. That's the head that I got my pointer on right there, right? Right there's the pointer on the head. Now here's the reason why this is such a PETA and why so few people ever want to work on these old trucks mechanic-wise. You see this damage here, right? We can't zoom in anymore, but what you've got, if we just hold the camera steady right here, what you've got here is you can see that the corrosion has eaten past the threads into the shank of the bolt. And so what's going to happen here, if you apply any torque at all, it's going to snap right there. And the reason for that is in this particular design, this is all exposed to the elements. So you got heat cycling, super hot, it's getting hit with water when it's in a, weather like snow or rain, and then especially if you live up north, it's also going to be getting hit with salty precipitation in the wintertime. So, but that's the problem, right? So there's not really much we're going to be able to do here. We're going to go ahead and try, right, to get these off. If this was a gas engine design with studs and nuts, we could almost always get the nut off, but with these bolt type designs, we're going to be fighting the same type of fight that you'd have if you were trying to remove the studs from the exhaust manifold itself. So sometimes shops will want to cut these and just not deal with it, right? Just cut it right off, get the over out so you can at least get going with the job of pulling the transmission, and then you deal with getting these out of the exhaust manifold separately. Of course, they're on a lift, and it's a lot easier to drill these out or try to deal with them that way. But in any event, that's the problem. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get these. I'm not necessarily going to show you. There's nothing really to show here. We'll try to, I'll show you some of the things I'm going to try, and eventually we'll either get them out or they'll break. All right, guys, so I told you I'd show you some of the tools I'm going to be using for this job. This is one of the tools. This is an AC Delco rust penetrant and an inhibitor. It's something you would normally use like on heat valves and chokes. Old school stuff, but they still sell this. There's also a very similar product from Mopar that works really good. This is like a foaming kind of penetrant. Works really good for this type of problem. Now, I know it works well on nuts after you've heated them up. We're going to give it a shot on this and see if it gives us any extra benefit. The other tool I'm going to be relying on here, you can use a torch but I'm a fan of these inductive heaters like this bolt buster. This heats up the metal just like a torch, but it does it through magnetic induction, so there's no flame with this type of product. And what I'm going to be using on that, there's a couple of different tips for that. And so what I'm going to be trying to do is I'm going to be trying to come in with two things, depending on my clearance. I'm either going to come in with this larger one and angle this guy down so I can catch the flange and heat it up on the flange area like that. If I don't have any luck with that, then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to take this particular type of adapter and I'm just going to wrap it around the flange. I'm going to cherry the whole thing and give that weakened bolt as much of a chance as it can to come loose. You know, the thinking is when you do something like this, if you think about a nut, or think of a nut first, right? So you got a nut sitting on a screw. When you heat it up, it opens up and you can get things off a lot easier. It's exact opposite when you have a stud or a bolt into a threaded flange, right? But the same principle applies. It's in there nice and tight. You heat up the flange and the nut can come out. So that's what you use tools like this for. So if it goes smoothly, I'll show you a clip of that. I don't expect it to go smoothly. I expect these things to break off, but we'll see. All right, guys, on the passenger side here, just showing you the orientation of my bolt buster. Same deal, tire off the wheel, dust shield off so you can get access. There's a lot less room on this side, and if the gods are not with you, this is the one where you're going to have trouble because you got almost zero access. But fortunately for us, we didn't have any trouble. I allocated about 2 hours to this job and we used about all of it, but we have no broken bolts. Yay! So you can see here the technique I used with the bolt buster by putting the coils right around the triangle of the upper threaded flange that's on the exhaust manifold. So this is the only one that's really visible on this side. You heat this guy up, and then you come in from underneath, and work it off. Now, I use that AC Delco exhaust lubricant liberally, and I'm a fan of that. I let it soak for 45 minutes, and then we'd go hit it with a breaker bar, and then we'd heat it again, and we'd hit it, and then we'd heat it again, and we'd hit it, and finally, each of these gave out. So let's take a look at those bolts. All right, guys, so these are the bolts that we pulled off the driver's side. And if we zoom in here, you can see the risk of failure is very obvious, right? So this is why we took so much time. This was ready to break. It would have broke right there. But by being patient and a lot of heat, you can see the threads inside the flange were fine. So we just had to break this rust torque caused by the corrosion here, and then we were able to get these threads to come out, right? The flange attaching the crossover is not threaded, just the flange on the exhaust manifold. Here's another view. This one here, even worse, right? Super lucked out that this did not snap. Now remember the technique here with this kind of situation, right? Once you get it out, what I try to do is I try to do with the ratchet, 1, 2, 3, back, 1, 2, 3, back. If you get any resistance at all, tighten it all the way back in and start over again. That's part of why you budget so much time. And some of you are watching this saying, oh, geez, just throw an impact wrench on there. No, you don't. Because if you do, they're going to snap off, and a 2-hour job is going to become a 12 or 48-hour job, right? So that's why you spend the time. Now, the third one on the driver's side wasn't too bad. Wasn't too bad at all. So, and then the three that we took off the passenger side, they're actually in fairly decent shape, and mostly because some time back, if you see one of my earlier videos, we had an oil leak coming from the turbo. And I think that saved these because that turbo leaked for a few years before I bothered to do anything about it. And so you can see, even though it's got the same kind of setup and these were exposed, they're corroded. You can feel it, but they did not wear through. Anyway, we're going to toss all 6 of these and replace them with brand new GM bolts. Let's go ahead and get underneath and continue. All right, guys, we've got this exhaust crossover pipe out. One of the things you want to take a look at while you have it out is you might have to do some wire wheeling on the end. This one we definitely will because we've got some debris and some very minor surface corrosion, but it might even have pieces of the gasket still on here, like right there. We'll want to get cleaned up, but what we're really looking for is we want to make sure that this guy is not corroded through because if it is, we're going to have to toss it and replace it. Same thing, you want to check out the flange. This is a hunk of steel or iron, so it should be in good shape, but you still want to check it out for any cracks. And then now that you have an opportunity to see the other side, you can check the whole thing for any corrosion, pinholes, anything like that, and replace it if you find any. And similarly, you want to check this end as well. It's normal to find some soot on the inside here, but you should not find any perforations in the steel. All right, let's keep going. All right, guys, with that crossover pipe out of the way, we can finally get after the inspection cover. We've got 3 15mm bolts on each side, 1, 2, and 3. Same thing on the driver's side. We're on the passenger side. And then on this diesel engine, we have 1 crossmember support. There's a 15mm on this end as well as the other end. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to work these 15s off. I'm not going to necessarily film me taking these off, but we'll come back after we got them all off. All right, guys, we've got only 1 bolt left holding this cover on, and we can't take the last bolt off just yet, but we have the other 5 of the 6 off. We also have the 15 that was holding this support brace. At the other end of this support brace is an 18mm bolt and nut, at least on this diesel engine. You just need to loosen the 18mm nut and the brace will fall out of the way. So at this point, we're almost ready to take this off. We're not going to take it off all the way yet because on this diesel engine, we're going to have to loosen up the starter to get this off, and we're going to need to take the starter off anyway as part of getting access that we need to separate the flex plate from the torque converter. But this is all we wanted to do under here for now. The next thing we're going to do, we're using our light, is actually on one of these mounting bolts, but we've got these 2 15s that hold the starter motor. So to get this, we're going to go under, disconnect the batteries, disconnect the back electrical connections on the starter, and then we're going to loosen up the starter so that we can get this cover off. And then we can get the starter separated off from the flex. All right, guys, now we need to disconnect the battery so that we can disconnect the starter. Now, we're going to use the hood light to make sure that we've completely de-energized everything. This particular engine, like I mentioned before, this being a diesel, there's 2 batteries. So disconnecting 1 negative is not enough to shut off the light. So everything's still energized. We're going to come over and do the second battery as well. If you're on a gas engine, you only have to do this one unless you have the auxiliary battery option on your truck. Once we take this one off, now our light's out, and now it's safe to disconnect the starter motor. All we really need to do is slide it back. We've disconnected the battery. We've got these transmission cooler lines kind of obstructing our view. I'm not really ready to start disconnecting all of that yet. So what my plan is to take the 2 bolts off, move the starter back out of the way, so that, and then be able to lower it with a helper so that we can then disconnect it. It really can't get access to the electrical connectors from the wheel well area. It's just too cramped there. So we're going to need to take it back, lower it, and then we'll be able to disconnect it and pull it out. So just going to show you guys, these screws here. I've already broke the torque on them. They're 15mm. They're super long, but once you break the torque, they should come out pretty easily. Most important thing was to make sure that you disconnected the battery, right? So there's a special knurled connector. We can see there's really no corrosion at all on the part that goes into the block, just the part that's not into the block all the way. All right, that's one. This one. And make sure you got safety goggles on, right? Because you got dirt and rust dust and all kinds of other crud coming down. Might even have some oil inside of it, depending on what else you got going on your engine. This one's got a little bit more force to it than the other one did, but you can finger it off. All right, there's that one. Now we can something else holding it. And I think I know what it is. I think there's a brace on these diesel starters in the other side. So Gonna go put this guy back in there, and we'll go take that brace off, and then we'll come back around here. All right, guys. Yeah, these 6.5 liter diesel starters have a brace on them. There's so much torque. They have a brace that attaches. With a 13 millimeter up here at the top is easier to get than the one on the actual starter. So we're going to pull this guy. Maybe. I can get the torque broke on it, we can ratchet it off. All right, she's turning. Just don't have a lot of room up here to work. There we go. All right, so I won't necessarily bore you guys with this whole thing, but we're going to take this bolt off, and then we'll be able to come back down and show bringing the starter down. All right, guys, now with that brace removed, we can return to what we were trying to get done over here. So we're just going to put a little bit of slack on this last bolt holding our cover on. Try not to make too many banging noises. See if that's enough slack to get our starter out of its little resting spot here. Looks like it is. Almost. Let it rest on there for a second. Go ahead and remove this the rest of the way. Sorry about that, guys. It's really contorted and awkward position. Got my thumb supporting the starter with my rest of my hand trying to hold this cover in place while we get this stubborn last bolt to let go here. All right. Now I'm just going to slowly let this guy out. Okay, now I'm going to let this guy come down past these cooling pipes. Rest it right here, because what we'll be able to do now is we'll be able to access finally and remove the electrical connections from the back of the starter motor. So that was what this whole project was here. Now if you look up on top here, now with the inspection cover off, this will be one of our next steps. Is here's the torque converter, here's the flex plate coming from the engine. On the other side here are the bolts. They attach to these welded on pieces on the torque converter that you see here and here. We'll next be taking those off so that we can push this back in, and then after that we're going to drain the fluid out of the... All right, guys, what we decided to do is just bungee this starter up. The only reason I wanted to get it out of the way is so that we'd have an ability to come in here and get an impact wrench in here to remove these bolts that are holding the flex plate and the torque converter together. So here is your flex plate with all these teeth. This is what you have on an automatic transmission. If you had a manual, it'd look very similar, but it would be called a flywheel. And there's, on this 4L80E, I think there are 6 of these, 5 or 6, I can't recall. We'll find out as we get them off. The first thing I'm going to be doing, though, is marking where the bolts went, just in case you're going to reuse the torque converter. So I'm just going to put a mark on the head, and a mark on here, and a mark on the flywheel right below the bolt. And I'm going to be doing the same thing here. So that I'll do 1. And on this one I'll do 2. Tight squeeze in here. So you won't be able to get a socket in here. Now you might be able to turn this with a box end wrench. Slide that on the bolt and you'll be able to turn it. On a diesel engine, less 6.5 liter, there's no way you're going to be able to turn this. Just be trying to push against these teeth. There's just too much compression going on. And I'm not going to screw around with doing the extra work to pull out glow plugs and all that just to get this off. The technique I'm going to be using is I might use this to do fine adjustments to get this into position where I want. But what I'm mostly going to be doing is getting this to where I can get access to the bolt that's in the cavity that was previously occupied by the starter. And it's a lot easier if you have a short stubby, but even this big old 19-volt Craftsman impact wrench will fit in here. We're going to get him right on the bolt there. We're going to zip these off like that. And the way we're going to rotate it, you see these standoffs that are welded onto the torque converter. All we're going to do is come up here with a pry bar. Just want to make sure you take note of making sure that the curved end isn't going to hit on the aluminum, and we'll be able to turn this with the pry bar like that. So with the impact here and all this hollow metal, it's going to be really noisy, so it's definitely going to be a hearing protection kind of deal. And rather than narrate this, I decided just to explain to you what I'm going to do. I'll zip off a couple of these just to show you what's going on, and then we'll go back to narration when we're done. There's one. That's it, guys. Just keep going that same way. All right, guys, with the last bolt off, all 6 of them removed, now you should be able to push the torque converter back. And what you're going to do is you're going to take note of the gap between the torque converter and the flex plate. This is very important. So pushed it back with my hand. Just going to take a pry bar and I'm just going to very gently, do not put any specific pressure on this flex plate. And that gap there is very important because that gap is the gap that you should see when you put this transmission back in. And even if you change out the torque converter with a rebuilt one, you should have a very similar gap. So you should not be putting this on and have it be like that, because that would indicate you do not have the torque converter on the pump correctly. So we're going to make sure we have a gap like this. We're going to take note of how much it is. I'm going to separately get over here and measure it for myself, take a picture of it. But at this point, we've got this part done, and we're ready to move on to the next step. All right, guys, next up is this transmission heat shield. This heat shield is protecting the 4L80E from the exhaust piping that's right here. It's held in by two 10mm bolts. One's very obvious right here. The other is on a horizontal tab, and this one you can see this particular shield is broken. So now we're realizing this is something else we're going to have to go get and replace at the salvage yard. These are not available anymore from GM. I'm going to go ahead and take this off. I'll show you how you would get the other one off after we take this off since it's broken. Just get this out of the way first. Just move our light like that. Let's get this to where we can get it out with our finger. Stick this guy back in here for safekeeping so we don't lose him. Actually, nope, we probably need to keep him off because I see it's also got a bracket that we do not want to have attached here, and we drop the 4L80 for these, it looks like heater hoses. So I guess we'll leave that off and we'll put them in a little baggie. All right, the way you would get, with this removed, we can finally see the writing, 4L80E hydromatic up here. The way you would get this off if it wasn't broken is you just slap a small, maybe 2-inch extension on here, which is what I'm going to show you. And you would come up above this. I can't do it without blocking your view, guys, but you'd come up with a setup like this, maybe even a wobble with those pipes there. And that's how you would take this top one off. I'm going to have to get up here and get this separately just because it's broken. With that off, the next thing that we're going to go after I get that bolt out of there is the two cooling pipes. So you got one here and one here. Right? And we're going to spray some silicone on these white nylon covers just so they don't break, because they are probably very fragile after 23, 24 years here. When we pull those off, it's going to reveal a little ring clip that holds this on, very similar if you've ever seen the oil cooler lines on a Vortec V8 from the 90s. It's the same kind of deal. So we'll get that off next, and then after that, we're going to go drain the fluid. So let me go ahead and get that bolt out of the way, and we'll come back and I'll show you this other two. All right, guys, so you can see, if you zoom in, you can see there's little plastic tabs on this thing that help hold it onto the pipe. And those are the things that are going to get weak with age that we're going to try and help out here with a little silicone spray. Let's let that sit for a second, and we're going to shift our attention to the other one that we already sprayed. Take some long nose pliers. Get it back behind it and just pop it off nice and gently. Again, we're trying not to break anything. Block your view for just a second here. All right. So now we have access to a little clip. Now let's go ahead and get this guy off over here. Okay, no breakage. Now I'm going to have to grab a mirror and see if I can see the orientation of the clip. All right, guys, we're going to come in here and get these clips off. I've zoomed in on it for you. You can see there's a little clip ring that slides into this groove. Like I said, it's just like those Vortec V8 oil cooler lines. So we're going to take a 90-degree pick. We're going to try to pull that guy out of there. Now we've got this bracket in our way on this side here, so bear with me for a moment. Having to fight the bracket, and I'm trying to come in between the bracket and the back of the transmission. Okay, so now that we've got that in there, now we're going to try to work it out the other side. You can see in the mirror up here, hopefully. All right, you can see that we have got it coming off and out. And that's it. That's all there is to those. You take both of those out. All right, first we're going to come up here and try to put a little penetrating fluid to ease this guy out. Take our handle and actually tap it back down, because that's just going to end up working the penetrating fluid back down there. And then I'm going to take a bit of paper towel here. Just want to make sure we don't damage the pipe. I give this another shot. Block your view for a moment. She goes. So we'll get a rag under here until this fluid subsides, so it doesn't end up down in our face. And then we'll just go do the same thing on the other connection, and we'll be done with the step. All right, it's time to drain the pan. I'm going to show you the old type of drain plug first. These are the original type from back in the 90s. It takes a T55 type of Torx bit. It goes in here. These are usually pretty chewed up by this time, and they usually get replaced. This is a different truck, just to show you what you might see and what type it takes. Let's go to the truck that we're actually going to have to drain, which has got a service replacement on here. All right, guys, so this is the type that you'll find if it's been replaced. So if those 255s strip out, you'll get one of these AC Delco replacements. That's a 15 millimeter. And even these can get on there kind of tight. Go ahead and pop this out, let him drain, and then as soon as he's done, we'll continue. All right, guys, now that we're done with the passenger side with the exhaust shield and the cooling lines and draining the transmission, we're on the driver's side now. We're going to start with these two wiring harness clips. So I'm just going to take a screwdriver, get underneath so that we can release them, so that they can not hold these harnesses as we lower the transmission. So this one's towards the front. There's another one just like it here towards the back. All right, so now we've got those free. We can work them out. Make sure you got your eye protection on, guys, because there's going to be sand and all kinds of crud falling down. Work this one over here out as well. All right. All right, now with that out of the way, let's reposition the camera and let's go after some of these other components. All right, the next thing we're going to do, guys, I'm going to mark this little lever for the neutral safety, or excuse me, for the shift position, just to roughly indicate where it is in case we accidentally mess it up and forget. It's not critical, but it's something we're going to do. So while that's drying, all right, guys, after you mark this, and again, this is optional, just in case that you end up messing something up and you want to remember the park position. You know, technically, you just push it all the way to the front, and you got that. All right, the next thing we got to take is the shift lever off. So that's held on by one small U-clip here that you can take off with a screwdriver, right? and then there's a bushing that fits on top of a stud on this lever. Now, this cable was changed about a year ago, so I don't expect there to be any problem popping it off. But if you've got the original cable on here, there's a good chance that the bushing will break. All right, you can't really see it from this angle on the camera, but that's what's going on there. Now, to get this cable off, we're going to have to pinch the end of it. And what I'm going to do is reach my hand around this crossmember, and I'm going to take the cable off this retaining ring that it's sitting on right here. And then up on top here, there's a couple of little wings. Right in the front, where we took the clip off, right in the front where we took the clip off, there's a couple of little retaining wings. And we're going to give those a pinch while we pull this backwards. Then when we pull it back, we'll be able to slide it out of this bracket. All right, kind of let this sit on top of the torsion bar out of your way. All right, so the next two things we've got to go here, we've got a primary wiring harness connector here, this big round thing, and then we've got the neutral safety switch itself. So the next thing we're going to go after is this connector. You should just have to press it on the two sides and get it to release. Of course, it's going to be old. And this is an awkward position to be in. Let me see if I block your view for a moment. How that goes. Okay, there we go. So what you've got is, whoops, it's raining sand, dirt, and rocks. Eye protection, folks, eye protection. All right, what you've got are these two ridged areas on the side of the connector. You give it a squeeze and deform it, and it causes these clips here to let go. So that's how you get that guy off. Sometimes these things can be leaking. If they are, that means that the O-ring inside has shot, but this one's all right. All right, so now actually the hard part, the neutral safety switch. Now the reason I say it's the hard part is the factory glues these connectors in. So if you've never taken this off before, if you try just to lift up on these tabs, you pull this safety and lift up on that tab, more than likely you'll break the connector because they're literally glued in there. So a couple of options. One option is you could get a heat gun in here, heat this up, and get them off that way. Another option is you can just remove the whole assembly. It's held on by a bolt here and a bolt over here. And then this nut that's on top of the shaft, you'd have to pull the nut off and then pull this lever, and then this whole thing can come off. So rather than take a chance on damaging something, I'm just going to pull the whole assembly off. Now to get this nut off, you have to get a hold of it with an 11 millimeter in the back side. Let me see if I can get you guys a better view of the light for this operation. All right, so the 11 millimeter is going to fit down on this shaft. Get the crud off of it. Should be an 11 millimeter. There it is. All right. Yeah, guys, if you've never taken this stuff off, there's mud and corrosion just flaking off of here so that we can get a good grip with the tool. But it looks like we got a good grip on it now. Now, I wanted to come in from this angle, but the stud's in our way, so we have to do this angle. All right, and then we're going to grab our 15 millimeter, and we're going to see if we can do this by hand. The reason you have to hold this is otherwise it'll try to work its way through the shift positions. All right, once you break the torque, you can just switch to a box end wrench or something like that. I'm definitely trying not to be directly underneath any of this stuff just because of the dirt and crud that's coming off. All right, so this nut comes off of here. him aside. This guy wiggles off. And the paint mark will, again, help us if we mess up the orientation of the park position. And I think these also are 15s. Nope, those are 13s. And naturally, I did not bring a 13 over here. So let me grab a 13. We'll pull these two nuts off and we'll pull this off. All right, guys, 13 on a breaker bar. Just going to break the torque. Get this one here now. The torque broke. We'll switch to our gear wrench. It was actually already loose to come off by hand. Okay. And then we'll get the one here in the back. That's funny. One in the front was super loose, and this one's super tight. All right, before you take this off, I want to point out to you, there's a tool that you have to have when you put this back on if you get this out of position, right? So we're going to try and leave it in this park position so we can pop it back on. If for some reason you get it in another position, you're going to have that tool to line it back up in the neutral position before you reinstall it, right? So at this point, sometimes you need to put a little bit of PB Blaster on here, but let's see if we can just work this off without... So I don't have to make another trip out from under the vehicle. So we're just going to kind of, first thing we're trying to do is just get the little pebbles and stones that are trapped behind here out of the way. As you can see, they keep falling. And then with that out of the way, I'm just going to try and work this off. There's more of them. Jesus. 23 years of rocks and pebbles, guys. They all decide to get wedged in behind this neutral safety switch because I'll show you in a minute why. And again, we're trying to keep that in the same position. So what happens is, you see like right here's another one, right? They get up on top of this ledge and they get trapped in here. So, all right, so we will bungee this guy up around here later. So at this point, we've got a sensor right here. Just simple pull down and work out type of connector. And the only thing we have left, guys, the only thing is you can see there's a vent hose. And we're just going to have to figure out on top where that elbow is and pull this vent hose. And at this point, we're ready to start pulling the bolts to the engine block. All right, guys, we're back on the passenger side. Right, there's our cooler line. And there's our other cooler line, right, just to give you an orientation. And we found that where the vent line goes in, if you can see the mirror up here, the vent line plugs into a port right in the very top of the transmission midway. So we can't really get our hand up there. We're going to have to disconnect this after we get it lowered a bit from the engine. But that's where it is, just so you know reference-wise. All right, guys, while we're over here on the passenger side, we're going to go ahead and get this 13 millimeter nut. It's holding on this little bracket. There's a couple of these that we'll have to get off before we can actually take off the mounting bolts. And it's the beginning of some very awkward and very creative use of extensions. I'll try not to keep hitting the exhaust manifold here. I'm not going to bore you guys with taking this whole thing off, but you get the idea, right? So this is a 13 millimeter on all of these nuts that are attached, holding various brackets. So we'll pull this 13 off here on the passenger side, and then we'll go get the same type of one off the driver's side. All right, guys, so after you get this nut off here, then you can just prise this little thin metal wire harness retainer off. Just be careful with it so you don't bend it. There we go. We got that off. Now we can go on the driver's side. All right, guys, back here on the passenger side. Coming this way, a lot of light. We've got this fuel harness right up here, and then right up there is the next one of these 13s that you need to pull. All right, guys, you can see we've got that 13 millimeter nut off of this particular stud on this mounting bolt, and now we're going to go up under the hood. We can't move the bracket yet because it's retained by an additional 13 millimeter nut further up that we can't see from this position underneath the vehicle. All right, guys, under the hood now, we're going to need to remove this turbo power engine shroud off the 6.5 liter diesel engine so that we can get better access here in the back, and that's held on by 4 10 millimeter bolts. I'm going to be using a topside creeper to reach over and access this, as well as the other nuts that we're going to need to pull to finish getting this transmission off. So we'll pull these off and we'll come back. All right, guys, with the shroud out of the way, the next thing we're going to go after is the transmission dipstick. So if we follow this guy down, we'll see that there's a 15 millimeter nut attaching the bracket onto a stud along with a ground lead. So we're going to take that 15 millimeter nut off so that we can remove the little flag piece that's welded onto the dipstick tube. So it might block your view here for just a moment. So we're going to get that 15 on there, and because it's so cramped, my advice is just to use 3/8 hardware for this. You'll never get anything that's a half in here with all the wiring harnesses and glow plug leads and everything like that. All right, so we'll take this guy off, and I'll show you how to get this tube out. All right, guys, with that nut off, you should be able to wiggle this tube, just like you see me doing here. If you go down and see where the nut used to be, that welded-on flag piece should be nice and loose. So to get the rest of the way, we're going to go back underneath, and we're going to prise it up. All right, guys, under the transmission, or rather under the vehicle, and on the passenger side of the transmission, this is your dipstick tube going into the housing here. There'll be a rubber kind of gasket here, and then if we peel this back, we'll see there's a small ridge. I don't know if you guys can really make that out, but there's a small ridge going all the way around this guy, which is part of what seats it into that gasket. See if I can find a better view. I don't know. It's really no way to really show that in there. Maybe you can zoom in just a hair more here. But there's a little ridge right there. And that ridge is what you're going to need to be able to push against in order to get this guy up while you get a helper pulling up on the other side. So the whole idea here, I can't really get this on video because I'm going to have to get right where this camera is, but we're going to be tapping this guy up with a small plastic hammer until we get it to separate between the tube and the grommet, and then between the person helping pull you up and the tapping, it'll slowly work its way out. So I'll get it part way and then we'll come back. All right, guys, we've got this up a little bit. What we've been doing is we've been taking a small screwdriver, or maybe a medium-sized screwdriver, and wherever we still have the gasket present, we've been giving it a few taps between the gasket and this ridge I mentioned earlier, because we don't want to damage anything. It's okay if you scratch the paint. We don't want to dent up anything. And so we've got it moved up about 1/4 of an inch or so. And if we keep wiggling it from above, what we've also done is we've given it a few squirts of penetrating oil
trying to get that to get in there between the tube and the gasket. We don't care about the gasket because that's going to have to be replaced anyway, but it's almost like a radiator hose where you're trying to break the adhesion and work it out. So we're just going to keep at it and slowly work it out here. All right, guys, I think we're at the point where we can get this out. So we're going to come in here with an angled pair of long nose pliers, and the reason we're using an angled pair is we want to both be able to get in here and grab the gasket against the pipe, or the tube rather, so we don't damage it. And then we want to have it bent so that we can kind of tippy tap against the housing of the transmission while somebody pulls from above. There we go. All right. So there's the tube, and then here, if I zoom out a little bit, this is the gasket. It's kind of like stuck on the tube there. Now what we're going to do is we're not going to try to actually remove this. This is good enough for now. We just want to get this in this position so that we can lower the transmission. When we put the transmission back, we're going to put a new gasket on here, and I'll show you the position for that. And as we raise the transmission up, we're just going to raise it onto this tube. That's the way you get these on and off. Don't try to remove it. There's just too many wiring harnesses and cooling lines up above to get that out of there. And it's not going to come down from below either. So at this point, we're done with that piece. All right, guys, now that we've got the tube loosened, we do need to remove the dipstick, clean it up, and store it, because there's a chance that the tip could be bent in the process of removing or reinstalling the transmission. All right, guys, after you get the engine shroud off, we can look at the fuel filter module and we can pan towards the firewall. And then if we zoom in, we'll see that second 13 millimeter nut that's retaining the fuel line bracket. This one's not accessible from below, like we mentioned earlier. So you got a couple of options here. You can either try to move some of these cables and harnesses out of the way and try to get it from up on top here under the hood, or you can get it from underneath by lowering the transmission. We're going to go for the latter option, but I just wanted you to familiarize yourself with where it is. Let's go ahead and look at a couple of more fasteners that we've got in this area. All right, guys, if we move to the left of the fuel filter module and we slowly pan down and zoom in, what we'll find is the cast boss of the 4L80E transmission's 12 o'clock mounting bolt position. So that's that square piece that you see right in the center of the screen. The 4L80E has 7 mounting points. On this particular 1999 engine, only 6 of them are used. I'm just showing you that on this particular model, that 12 o'clock position, that 7th one, is empty. So if we take a look over here on the right side of the fuel filter module, and if we zoom in there, I've put a flashlight and a mirror into position. And if we zoom in, we can see that there is no bolt installed by the factory in this position for this particular engine. And again, this is a 6.5 liter diesel on a 99 associated with that 4L80E. So you can see that that bolt is not used. So we're only dealing with 6 bolts, guys, but they are going to be a PETA. All right, guys, towards the passenger side, for vehicles that have rear heat, you'll have a couple of cooling lines that are heading down here, and they'll be secured by like a T-shaped bracket that you can see here. So each side of the T is holding one of the hoses, and then the middle part of the T is secured to one of the studs that's holding the transmission to the engine. So there's going to be another one of these 13 millimeter nuts. We can't get a mirror in here. We can't get you a view. It's super, super cramped on this Suburban body style with this setup. But got this little pointer here, this wooden pointer dowel is showing you there's a wiring harness right behind the bracket, and that relative position is where you'll find the additional 13 millimeter nut that's holding this bracket on. All right, guys, it's time. So if you followed along with my transfer case removal video, you'll be at this point here where we hand tighten these two 15 millimeter nuts. They're holding the rear transmission mount. And then if we pan up on top, we've just snugged up these 15 millimeter bolts that hold the upper part of the rear transmission mount to the transfer case adapter on the rear of the transmission. We are now going to remove those again and take out, in preparation to take out this mount. And the other thing we're going to do is we had previously removed these 18s that you see right here and right there, and we just had them in here just to hold it for alignment purposes. There's an 18mm bolt and a special kind of 18mm nut on the other side. We're going to go ahead and remove those so that we can take this middle rear mount cross member and twist it out, and I'll show you twisting it out. But what we're going to have to do is get a jack under here, a transmission jack, so that we can pull them out, hold up the transmission while we take out the cross member. All right, guys, just a couple of words on the jack itself. So recommend a transmission jack rather than a floor jack because of the weight of this 4L80E transmission. You can get something like this from Harbor Freight. This one works great. I think the weight on this guy, pounds, something like that. I'll roll something at the bottom with the exact weight from the service manual, drained so that you know. The metal plate here, so they have all these kinds of adapters on these things, but you want to make sure you're not doing any denting to the pan on the 4L80E because the pickup for the fluid is very close to the bottom of the pan, so it needs to stay very straight. So we pulled all of these off except for just one where there's an indentation on the pan, so this won't hit it, but we don't want these nuts, these heads on these bolts creating any kind of dents. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to throw a small piece of wood on there again just for some cushion. So we're going to position this underneath the pan, get it into position, and I'll show you how we remove that cross member. All right, guys, we got our jack in position. You can see there's a little tape measure here just for reference, so you can see we're going to raise this up just slightly so that we can pull that mount out. Just to give you an idea about how far it comes up, you can see on the tape measure. And then from that position, we should be able to reach up here, just wiggle this guy out, hopefully without knocking our flashlight over. Just using a tool here because I don't ever like to stick my hand up with something like that. And now, with the 18s off of this cross member, you see she'll move. Right? And we're just going to slide her on one side all the way back until we hit the torsion bar cross member on the passenger side or whatever side you start on, and then I'm going to walk over to the opposite side and move it in the other direction. And that, by doing it catty corner like that, we'll be able to remove it from the vehicle. So this side, we're going to go forward, right, and then she'll drop down. So lay it on this side, go back on the other side, get it off, and now at this point, we're able to drop the transmission low enough so that we can see the bolts and nuts that we can't access from under the hood. All right, guys, this is the tool we're going to be using when we lower the rear end of the transmission. So what I've got on here is a special purpose extension. This one I've got, I'll put a link in the description, is 32 inches long. So we're going to be getting those nuts off with it's a 3/8 size. So we got 3/8 swivel, 3/8 13 on here for the nuts. And then just for some more leverage, you're going to use a 1/2 inch ratchet with a 1/2 inch to 3/8 adapter. So that's how we'll get the nuts off. And then after that, we'll switch our hardware on the end to actually get the studded mounting bolts. All right, guys, now we got the cross member out. We raised it back up roughly to where it was with the mount. And hopefully there's enough light for you guys to see. What I'm going to do now is we're going to drop it down. We're going to try 1 inch first and see if that's enough, and maybe a little bit more. We don't want to go too far. We'll put too much stress on the engine mounts. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to slowly open up the transmission jack so that the transmission will start to come down. And you want to do it real slow so you maintain control. And then we're just going to watch this. When it feels like it's about 1 inch down, we're going to see if we can see our bolts. So I'm on the passenger side, so I'm going to be looking at the camera person to see if they can see the nut up there on the driver's side or not, or if we need to lower it a little bit more. But you guys get the general idea. So it's still not quite visible, so we're going to bring it down a little bit more. Bring it down another inch. And then we're going to pause and we're going to see if we can get a view or access to any of those nuts now. But the general idea here is going to be really hard to see. But with that tool I showed you earlier, if you can just get it to drop down enough where you can see it, then you can get your reach with that long extension and pull them up. So let me see if I can get a view for the camera so you guys can see that. All right, guys, so we repositioned the flashlight. So now you can see there's the driver's side 13 millimeter nut that's holding the top part of that fuel bracket that we need to get off. So that's the next guy we're going to go after with our tool. We're going to pull that, prise the bracket out of the way, and I'll come back and show you a view of that. All right, guys, here's just a quick shot, right? We're just loosening this guy up. Just to give you an idea of what you're working with here, and then you can see from the camera, hopefully, how far back I am with the wrench. Now I'm just laying at an angle here so that you guys can see. This is obviously not the best position to be in to remove it. I'm going to get in a better position when I get through with this shot. So let's just keep going. All right, guys, we went ahead and we took out the stud bolt that was behind this. On this model year, they're 15 millimeter, so that's one of 6 we've got. I'm going to go take the one that's right below that out. I'm not going to film that. All I'm going to point out to you guys is, and this is just grabbing a magnet can help get this kind of stuff out of here. I'm going to move the flashlight for a second. This guy down here at the very bottom, leave him, because you don't want to have the case crack with the engine in this position. So we're just lowering it to get these two. We'll put it back up after we do the passenger side, and these will be the last 2 we pull out. All right, guys, this is, we've got the 2 on the driver's side off, and we just left the one on the lower left on the driver's side. Now we're on the passenger side. We've left the one on the lower right. We took the middle stud bolt off, and now we've got this last one up here on top, number 6. We were expecting a 13 millimeter nut, but as we can see, what the factory did is they just put the 15 millimeter stud bolt right on top of that T-bracket holding the cooling lines that we looked at from under the hood. So we'll just pull the bracket off with a 15 millimeter, and that'll leave just the last 2 at the bottom. All right, guys, after all the bolts are out, we've got to get the transmission to separate from the engine. It's going to be probably pretty corroded on there. And so what I'm using is I take a brass hammer, and I've done a few taps along the front here so that I can get it cracked enough to get a pry bar in here on one side. And that's what I'm doing right now. Once we get a pry bar in on one side, we'll be able to lever the housing away from the engine dowel pin, which is usually what it's bound up on. Right, so you can see here now we're able to move this back and forth. Now we're going to have to go do this on the other side as well. But once we get that on both sides, we should be able to slide it back and lower it. And again, the jack and the block of wood here on the oil panel support the engine until we get this step done. So we're going to go repeat this on the other side, and then we're going to lower it down. All right, guys, we're finally done. The dowel was pretty corroded on the passenger side, so we had to slowly work a wedge in there. We first used a small chisel, and then we worked the wedge in there with some PB Blaster. We finally got it to let go. So at this point, you can see I can move the jack, and the transmission moves with it. So we're going to slowly lower it while we continue to walk it back. And what you want to watch for is, if you're binding up on anything. All right, so we're good here. There's a bracket for the cooling lines you want to watch out for. On the driver's side, we want to watch out for wiring harnesses that might get hung up on something. I'm going to flip over there in a minute and check that. Going to watch our dipstick tube that we removed earlier, make sure it's clear and okay. We can see right now that cooling lines are kind of binding up on the top ear of the housing, so we're going to have to kind of wedge them back as this comes down. So just watch for things like that as you bring it down. You can also try to maneuver it a little bit as it comes down to give you some more room and play. At some point before you let it all the way down, the one thing that we skipped earlier, if you recall, we did not disconnect that vent line on top. And so that's one of the things that we're going to want to take care of here in just a moment. Just want to clear these cooling lines. All right, so let me get this down and back a little bit and show you where we pull that vent line off. All right, guys, so just before we pull it out, we're going to go up here with our hose pliers, and we're going to work this vent hose off the top fitting. Be careful pulling on this because you're obviously going to be putting some counterbalance to your transmission. You don't want it to fall off the jack, but that was the last hookup we had. At this point, we can jack up the truck and slide it out. All right, guys, before we slid this out, I meant to show you this tool that we put in to keep the torque converter from popping out on us. This is a J21366. This is actually a Kentmore GM service tool, but you can craft something like this yourself, I suppose. It's just got a thumb screw that attaches to one of the lower two on either side, mounting bolts for the bell housing, and tightens up this piece of steel against the torque converter to keep it in position when you're jerking it around and swiveling it around, trying to get it out from under the truck. So I meant to show you this before we pulled it out. Just wanted to make sure I showed this to you so that you knew that this is something that you need to do. You need to mock up something, otherwise this guy could fall out on you. All right, guys, we ended up having to slide it out on the driver's side. We got it jacked up this distance you see here. What I elected to do is, because of the height of the transmission jack, which is a great tool to bring it down and to put it up, it's a little bit difficult to get it out and clear. Even with this 3-ton jack and its full height, we couldn't clear it with the transmission jack. So we used a couple of small floor jacks on both ends, block of wood underneath the transmission to the transfer case adapter, and then another one here on the front, 2x4 standing up like this on the front side, so that we could get it closer to the ground, and then we could pivot off onto wood. And what I like to do is just slide stuff off. That way you protect the drain pan, you don't do any damage to it, and we can clear it that way. You can lift up on the back with one hand and help you clear this very top peak, which is the highest part of the bell housing, past the torsion bar and the frame, which is where it's going to get stuck. Anyway, that's it. We got it out. This is it for the removal video. I'll be doing a teardown video and a rebuild video at some point later on. I hope this helped you out. If you got any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below. I try to include as much detail as possible on everything you might run into on pulling one of these 4L80Es. If there's anything that I missed, please feel free to point that out. If you found this useful and it saved you some time, go ahead and hit that like button. I'd really appreciate it. And as always, thanks for watching.